church family. I'm Mark White. I'm a youth worker here at First Baptist Church. This is the second in our series of devotional studies that were put together for you for the week of Passion Week. And this one is going to focus on the betrayal of Christ. Last time we talked about the triumphal entry of Christ on Passover week before His crucifixion. And today we're going to focus on His betrayal and His arrest and the prophecies that were fulfilled as a result of that. But as we look at those prophecies, we've got a few questions that I'd like you to ponder. First and foremost, have you ever been betrayed by a friend? Maybe were you betrayed by a coworker? Maybe even a family member. How'd that make you feel? Did it make you feel angry? Did it make you feel sad, bitter, depressed, anxious, helpless? You know, Jesus experienced all of those emotions as He experienced the betrayal that He experienced at the hands of Judas. So the other question we'd have is, what's it worth to you to betray a friend? To Judas, it was worth the price of a slave. I'll tell you a little story that kind of relates to this. I was in veterinary school probably 30 years ago, and they held an event each spring that was called the Vet Olympics. The Vet Olympics was a time where all the veterinary students would gather. It was usually right before final exams. We'd blow off a little steam, have some fun, have some games, have a fundraiser, and this Vet Olympics was one of those fundraisers. Well, one of the events was a wild steer saddling contest. And I had a couple of friends. We entered this contest, and the objective was that they had a roping steer. They'd put a halter on him, put a lead rope on him, put him in the bucking chutes at the end of an arena, give you the ends of the rope, open the gate. He'd come out. You'd have to hold him, put a saddle on him, and one of you had to ride him to the other end of the arena. Well, all the steers were prepared. Ours was the only one that was facing forward. The rest of them were facing backwards, so they came out of the chute kind of slowly, gave people time to get ready. Well, a roping steer's only objective is to get away from the guy that's trying to rope it. So as soon as you show him some daylight, he is hitting that opening really quickly. So they opened the gate, and this steer came out, and he hit me square in the chest, stuck a horn on each side of my arms. I rolled up on him like this, and I threw him in the middle of the arena. It looked really good. It looked like I meant to do that. I was just trying to get away from this thing. We got the saddle on him, got him to the other end of the arena, unsaddled him. I had chased the guy down there to get him across the finish line, and I passed out the other end of the arena. Well, what I didn't know is that steer, when he hit me in the chest, stuck his horn right in my armpit, and I was bleeding everywhere, and I had passed out as a result of that. So it was a very dangerous situation. We were about 20 miles from town, from a hospital. They got me in, got me stitched up, and everything turned out okay with that. But where am I going with that? Well, Judas said that Jesus was worth the price of a slave to him here. So 30 pieces of silver was the Old Testament amount to be paid for a slave that was gored to death by an ox as prescribed by the law of Moses. So apparently during that time they had animals that would get loose and gore a slave, and somebody had to give recompense for that slave's death. I didn't feel that day like I was worth 30 pieces of silver. I felt like I was worth a lot more than that when I was trying to survive that event. So if the ox gores a slave, male or female, the owner shall give to their master 30 shekels of silver, and the ox shall be stoned. So that's what Judas said Jesus was worth. He was worth the price of a slave. So who was Judas Iscariot? Well, he was a disciple. He was a follower of Jesus for those 3.5 years. He became an instrument of prophecy fulfillment during that week. If you look at the New Testament lists of the disciples, Judas is always listed last in that list. That shows a little bit of distancing maybe between him and the other disciples. His name kind of indicates that he was perhaps from the area of Judea, as opposed to the other disciples were from Galilee in the northern part of the country. There was a little bit of, animosity between those that lived in one area. The Judeans kind of thought they were a little bit better, perhaps, than the poor fishermen and farmers that lived in the northern part of the country. So that was a little bit of separation that occurred between them. The other thing is that there's no really recorded text of the calling of Judas, but something attracted him to Jesus, and Jesus chose him knowing that he was going to betray him someday. Judas was probably a very self-centered individual. He was probably looking out for his own best interest. Perhaps he thought Christ was going to usher in a kingdom, and he was one of these people that always kind of hang on to a political important person in hopes that they'll get some political appointment and can reap the financial benefits of that. You see that in the world today, throughout the world. People that follow after political leaders. Perhaps he thought Jesus was going to be usher in an earthly kingdom that he could attach himself to. And that would foster his own greed. It would foster his own lust for power. He'd been a witness, though, to all the miracles. He'd seen the feeding of the 5,000. He'd seen the people healed. He'd seen Jesus walk on water. He had witnessed all of these things. And he had even stuck it out through that difficult time when Jesus taught about the cost of discipleship. Judas had hung in there at that point. But you also have to think the other disciples apparently had some level of trust in Judas. They entrusted him with the purse, it said. It said that he was essentially the banker for the whole group. He kept up with the money. Now, John records that he helped himself to it, but I think he didn't realize that at the time. The first recorded words of Judas really reveal the greed that's within his heart. And that greed that's within his heart is revealed while Jesus is in Bethany. He's in the home of Lazarus, Mary and Martha, when Mary anoints Jesus' feet with a very expensive ointment. And this expensive ointment was probably worth, it says, about 300 denarii. That would be 300 days' wages that ointment was worth. And Judas's first words are this, found in John 12, 4 through 6. It says, "But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, he who was about to betray him, said, 'Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?' He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. And having charge of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it." So was this the beginning of Judas's disillusionment with Jesus, or had this kind of been going on for a while? Or was this really just a manifestation of the evil and the greed that's within his heart? The next day was the triumphal entry. Judas probably thought, okay, it's going to happen today. He's going to usher in the kingdom. This is it. This kingship is going to happen. I'm finally going to get what's due me. I'm going to get a place of authority. I'm going to get a place of position. But what does Jesus do immediately after he has the triumphal entry? Jesus starts teaching about his impending death. John chapter 12, verse 23 says, "And Jesus answered them, 'The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit.'" So this was probably the last straw for Judas. He was done with this. So he begins a plot of betrayal. So what's it worth to betray a friend? He went to the chief priest. He negotiated with them what it was going to be worth. And he negotiated with them that Jesus was worth 30 pieces of silver. And from that moment on, he sought for an opportunity to betray him. So the price of that betrayal, though, was foretold some 500 years before Christ with the prophet Zechariah. Zechariah says, "Then I said to them, if it seems good to you, give me my wages, but if not, keep them. And they weighed out as my wages 30 pieces of silver. Then the Lord said to me, throw it to the potter." Don't miss that. "The lordly price at which I was priced by them. So I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them into the house of the Lord to the potter." So Jesus and his disciples then are in the upper room. They're celebrating the Last Supper. You know, Jesus washed the feet of the very man that was going to betray him that night. That's usually the job of a slave, but remember, Jesus was sold for the price of a slave. So Jesus still exhibits his love for the very betrayer that was going to betray him. And knowing that, he says to Peter, when he's talking about being clean, he says, not all of you are clean. And so he's talking about Judas when he says that. So Jesus must have felt some of those same emotions, knowing that this impending betrayal is going to happen. He's got to have some anxiety over when one of his closest followers is going to betray him. Judas probably overheard him saying these things and probably even knew that he was referring to him. It's almost like Jesus is giving Judas one last chance to not go through with that action. But yet, he does. And it says in John chapter 13, verses 21 through 25, it says, after these things, Jesus was troubled in his spirit and testified, truly, truly, I say to you, one of you will betray me. The disciples looked at one another, uncertain of whom he spoke, and they were very sorrowful and began to say to him, one after another, is it I, Lord? He answered, he who has dipped his hand in the dish with me will betray me. The Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that man if he had not been born. Judas, who would betray him, answered, is it I, Rabbi? He said to him, you have said so. So this was fulfillment of prophecy that was found in Psalms chapter 41, written some 1,000 years before Christ, when it says that the closest friend is going to eat my bread and lift his heel against me. Jesus even honored Judas that day because he gave him the sop. That would have been the first bread. He would have given that to Judas. That's usually reserved for the honored guest. Judas probably received that. When he reached into the plate with Jesus, he probably really received that sop, that honored guest bread. So Judas departs the upper room. He goes to go about his betrayal, to gather the crowd to come, because he knew where Jesus always went. Jesus always went to the Mount of Olives, as it was his custom. He would go there and pray. And so he goes there, and then he returns with Judas. Judas returns with the soldiers, and he betrays Jesus with a kiss. And then the disciples flee, and they flee at the time of the arrest of Jesus. And this is another fulfillment of prophecy. As recorded there in Mark, it says that all of them fled, but it says in Zechariah that awake, O sword, against my shepherd, against the man who stands next to me, declares the Lord of hosts. Strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. I will turn my hand against the little ones. So Judas experiences some second thoughts the next day after the trial of Jesus, and he winds up in the hands of Pilate and is essentially sentenced to be crucified. And Judas, the very betrayer of Jesus, goes to those same chief priests and tries to return the 30 pieces of silver. And they say, what's it to us? And he takes those 30 pieces of silver and he throws them into the temple. And so what do the chief priests do with that? It says they go out and buy potter's field. Remember that? Remember when Zechariah threw the 30 pieces of silver into the Lord's house and it went to the potter? Judas threw it into the Lord's house and it bought potter's field that day. So to Judas, Jesus was worth 30 pieces of silver. What's that really worth? Well, the denomination in that day was probably the shekel. A shekel was worth about 4 denarius. So Jesus was worth 120 days' wages. That's a pretty paltry sum considering that Judas had followed him around for 3.5 years. So we'll end there today with this point to leave with you. What's Jesus worth to you?